Hey, 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 fans and friends of the Regeneration Podcast. We're back once again. Michael, this has to be, I think, one of the crazier times, right? Because the CSA is up and running. The bees, you just got some swarms we heard about last week. But what'd you get out in the CSA share this week?
What did we got out? Radishes, kohlrabi, bok choy, arugula, lettuce, bunching onions, garlic scapes. I know I'm missing something.
That's pretty good. And then what'd you put in? You're still planning things, aren't you?
Yeah, but it's starting to mellow out a little bit. The first 2 months the 2 months before the CSA starts are nuts. Yeah. Like 13, 14-hour days. But it's kind of slowing down now, which is at least the pace. I mean, there's a few things we got to keep on top of weeding, but it's not too bad. But I just came in from outside. Well, the bad part, I told you last time,
no rain.
No rain. We had a little bit of rain this week, thank God.
We have a lot.
But it's still drought conditions. The pasture isn't coming back yet. So
no.
And my cow and my goat are running out of pasture to graze on. So my son came to my rescue. My son sent me an early Father's Day gift.
I saw it online. Okay.
Yeah. And it's a light
one. I thought you had one. You were talking with Kingsnorth, I thought, or no, you were talking about Broad Forks.
Well, because I have one of those old True Value sites, probably from the 30s or 40s, weighs 10, 12 pounds, and you tire out quickly, and can't keep it that sharp. But these new ones are aluminum, and they have a really lightweight. I think the whole thing weighs like 3 pounds. So you don't get exhausted. But it's warm out, so I'm sweaty.
Say it, Gene.
I don't know anyone who can say my goat. I'm very suburban and urban.
I've had Nigerian dwarf goats. This is one of the rare times in my life where I couldn't say my goat or goats, but I will. With his voice piping in, I'll introduce our guest. But I was thinking, as I was kind of finishing up, have I read every word? No, but have I read a lot? Yes. That some of the listeners know that another kind of detour in my life, which was really important, is for years I was the office manager of a research project about an African-American theologian, first African-American theologian to meet Gandhi. His name was Howard Thurman. I was privileged to work with, it made me think of you, Gene, and I'll introduce you fully, because I was able to work with a Christopher Lasch student, and Christopher Lasch is big in your work. Her name was Catherine Tumber, who amongst other books.
Yeah, I know. I kind of know Catherine. I met her.
Yeah. When I was reading your work, I see, obviously people who read Lasch have a lot in common. She wrote a great book called Small, Gritty, and Green about cities like around where Michael and I live. We could repurpose, Rochester, these cities around the Great Lakes. There's going to be a population migration here. So we have a steady climate, even though it's not sunny all the time. The Great Lakes provide that. But at that same project, I worked with another scholar, really eccentric guy. His name was Peter Eisenstadt. And most of his work was in African-American history and culture. But one time he threw me these papers that he wrote early in his career, because I think he was an economic historian. And he said, you might find these interesting, but he thought they were stupid. But one was on the mythology of the founding of Wall Street. And they have their own mythos. It involves a buttonwood tree. And his paper said, like, almost everything they say about Wall Street and this kind of founding story is just made up. But nonetheless, there's an original Garden of Eden there. And then he had another paper on Wall Street and how not alchemical, but like the mythological and numerological use of numbers, like 7-year cycles. He could prove that so much prognostication was based on, myth making and so forth. I was just thinking of that because I thought of Christopher Lasch and Catherine, some overlap between your work, and this friend of mine who, in his eccentric way, got to the religious nature of Wall Street. And some of our guests might have guessed. Yep. I'm speaking of our guest this morning, Eugene McCarraher, Dr. Eugene McCarraher. He's a professor at Villanova, author of Christian Critics, Religion and the Impasse in Modern American Social Thought, contributes regularly to Commonweal, Hedgehog Review, and Raritan. And Catherine, my friend, contributes to Hedgehog and Raritan a lot, and also writes for Dissent in the Nation. He's a professor of humanities and history at Villanova University. And what a beautiful cover, too. What a big book. Beautiful cover. Amazing reviews. Say more, Gene.
Shows it myself.
That's great. Great. So
Yeah.
the author of The Enchantments of Mammon is the title. So welcome, How Capitalism Became the Religion of Modernity. Welcome, Dr. Eugene McCarraher. Glad to have you on this morning.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. So, Michael, you said you wanted to go in strong.
Yes, I'm always wanting to go in strong. So I this is the second time I bought your book. The first time I bought it,
Thank you.
I loved it, but
It's paying for
my
his kitchen
son,
remodel as we
was
speak.
my son's birthday. My son is really into, what do they call it? You know, holistic investment, or
Enchantments of
whatever it's
Mammon.
called. And he's in business. And I said, but he's got a moral compass. I said, you got to read this book. This is for you. So I gave it to him. So I bought another copy. And it was such pleasure to jump into it. Because not only, I mean, I was trying to go slow with this one, but it's, it's a 600-page book. And because your prose is so beautiful and it's so
It
well,
is.
so it's enjoyable. It's an enjoyable read. And then I saw you were coming on the show and I was like, I better hurry up. Because I was enjoying it, I was savoring it. But you start out with one of the primary things I'm interested in my own work when it comes to, economics and how we live. And this is the issue of enclosure. So, and I puzzle about this a lot. I think about enclosure quite a bit. So let me ask you, Gene, what is with enclosure? How does that figure into this big project here?
Well, it figures in a huge way because, well, first of all, let me step back and just say that one of the myths that I think a lot of people still have about capitalism is that it started off basically in cities and it started off with industrialization. This is not true because, first of all, in order to get an industrial workforce, mobbed into these factories and super factories eventually by the 19th century, the question would be, where are you going to get that workforce? Well, it had to come from the countryside. And so the enclosure of the commons, that part of the medieval manor that would have been open to everyone, that had to be enclosed. It had to be, you had to kick off the serfs or the peasants who were there. Now, this is a long process that takes place. It begins roughly in the 14th or 15th centuries. And by the 17th century in England, it's not so much complete, but it's achieved a certain degree of momentum. So you just kick the people off, and as Thomas More observes in Utopia, the sheep consume the men.
Yep.
You just put a lot of sheep on there so you can shear them, and you can sell the cloth on the market, and we're off to the races. Because where are these people going to go? Well, first, they're first going to become cottage workers, which is like a kind of proto-capitalist way of manufacturing. And then by the 17th and 18th centuries, you start a lot of these early capitalists began to get the idea that maybe we should mass these people in factories where we can basically steal their artisanal skills and start to mechanize everything. So I would say that enclosure, in fact, is not just something that happens with the land. It happens with any number of things like skill.
Bingo. Yeah. Yep.
I mean, one way to look at mechanization and what we today call automation, and I know this is something you want to talk to me about because I'm writing a book about this subject, automation, right now. One way to think about mechanization and automation is basically the enclosure of skills, the enclosure of artisanal skills, professional skills, and so on. And it's still going on, really. I think that to talk about enclosure is something that just sort of ended in the 18th century is completely wrong. This kind of dispossession is still going on. I was reading yesterday, there's a piece in The Nation about AI produced art. And, I mean, what's basically going on here is they're literally stealing, images from both live and dead artists and just funneling them through algorithms. And, what is that but a form of enclosure?
Mhm.
You're not only stealing aesthetic skill, you're actually stealing the product of that
Right.
aesthetic.
Or
And
if you think in terms of the 15-minute cities that are being proposed, right? That's nothing but enclosure, right?
that's right.
What's the definition of the 15-minute cities, Michael? I haven't heard of that.
Well, it's a bigger deal in England and I
Mhm.
think some other places in Europe than it is here yet. But the idea is that you'll have to have a pass and you can't go more than 15 minutes from your house, or you have to pay an extra tax or something like this.
Wow.
Right. And so it only can work by surveillance, right?
Yeah.
So it's the Chinese model. But
Yeah.
it's certainly enclosure. And even out here where I live, so in rural Michigan, you see this, what I think it's E.P. Thompson points out, yeah, they did this. It was all legal. It was all criminal,
Mhm.
right? Yeah,
Legal that's a big
because
concept for
the
Eugene.
guys
Yeah.
making the laws, and the guys will benefit from it.
As so often in history, the crime is what's legal.
Yeah,
Right.
I mean, the
But-
scandal.
And it's
So-
central to your definition of capitalism, Gene, that, that everything it's legal. It's legal,
right.
the
Well, that's
workers
what
are
happens-
free.
well,
Go
it's
ahead.
the same like what
Let me
happens
make
here.
I want to make a point, bouncing off of something that Michael just said, which is that yet another way to think about enclosure is a form of surveillance. Because one of the conclusions at which I've arrived about automation is that it is at least as much about surveillance as it is about cost cutting.
Mhm.
When you go back, I talk about this in Enchantments as well. I mean, when you go back to the first theorists of mechanization, who were also the first management specialists, right? I mean, people like Andrew Ure wrote this book entitled, revealingly, Philosophy of Manufactures. Ure is very clear about this, that the reason they're introducing what he calls the automaton is to control workers.
Mhm.
He doesn't talk that much about cutting costs or increasing productivity, even though that's clearly involved. His main interest is political.
Right.
It's not economic. He wants to make sure that these workers are doing what they're told. And the best way to do that is to basically make them adjuncts of the machine.
Right.
Mhm.
I think that's what's going on with automation.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's what happened over the course of the pandemic, right?
Oh, yeah.
Laptop class.
Yeah.
And I think so this is what you saw during enclosure, say, especially in the 17th century, 18th century, is that people will be thrown off the land. I think of the Romantic poet John Clare in particular. People would be thrown off the land, unable to make they could have a subsistence living by working from the land, but they're thrown off the land. They're driven into the cities like lemmings, and then what happens is they're demoralized.
Mhm.
They have a inclination toward alcoholism and prostitution out of desperation and despair, and that's part of the mechanism. That's how they become, they can wrecked. They're destroyed human beings, and then they're part of the machine. Then
capitalism is I think in some ways unique in this regard, that you don't necessarily need to repress people, you just demoralize them.
Mhm.
And then what you do is you supply them with this thing called consumer culture.
Mhm.
There's a great British historian, Gareth Stedman Jones, who once called this new sort of world of entertainment and sports and all this that was developing in Britain in the late 19th century. He calls it a culture of consolation, because he was interested. Marxists obviously are going to be interested in this question. Well, why aren't the workers revolting? Right? I mean,
Mhm.
their lives are immiserated. They've lost so much hope. Why don't they just rise up? Well, if they're demoralized, they're not going to rise up.
Exactly.
You just give them, as you said, you give them alcohol, you give them access to prostitution.
Legalized pot.
And if that doesn't work, You know,
Yeah.
you give them, I don't know, dance halls. You give them.
Mhm.
Gene, when you're the main theory, you know, and the main kind of um, connecting thread of your work is that, you know, instead of the disenchantment theory of Max Weber, and you can kind of explain that in a nutshell, because I want to tie into what we're talking about too. You're saying that no, disenchantment is wrong. It's a misenchantment maybe, or you know, another enchantment based on money, you know, and capitalism. But when we're talking about enclosure, it made me think too of another subject that comes up for you, and it's a big one for me. But it's the notion, you know, that, and again, if we're training people in a new religion, um, you know, it's changing. It's just changing the basic way people think and contracting their vision. But another big one that's seminal for you and everything you say is the notion of scarcity over surplus. That we had to be, and you know, that mass schooling is a form of, when you said it's like indoctrination, control. You know, whether it was John Taylor Gatto or others say, or you know, it's right there in John Dewey, that public schooling makes learning look like a scarce commodity. It's this thing that takes place in square rooms under fluorescent lighting. And all we know about the person standing in front of us is that they've been in this wacky environment longer than we have. They may be bright like Gene and Michael. They may not be. But what we definitely learned, the medium being the message, is that schooling is a scarce commodity. Education is a scarce commodity. And that's just another form of enclosure, isn't it? And it's one, you know, scarcity is a biggie versus surplus. But sometimes I hear Michael and I we meet brilliant people like Eugene, and we're giving our listeners, you know, the key concepts just to start shaking the whole thing up. But a big one for me is surplus and scarcity. Can you kind of riff on that theme for a little bit, maybe while giving people the overarching kind of story of your book?
So let me talk a little bit about scarcity as a way into the thesis of the book, or maybe theses might be better. Yeah, scarcity is absolutely central to the capitalist worldview.
Absolutely.
You know, because, well, first of all, you know, let me just put it this way. So whenever I teach freshmen, and whenever, especially when I believe it or not, I get a lot of business students in my courses. And one of the things I will say to them right up front is that your first 2 days in Econ 101, you're not in an economics class, you're in a philosophy class. You may not have realized this.
Yeah.
So they'll look at me like, you know, what are you talking about? And I said, well, think about scarcity. When you're told that the world is a place of scarce resources, that is a metaphysical and ontological assertion. You may not realize that, but it is.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, at the same time, you're being told that human beings are essentially these rational, utility maximizing monads.
Big for you. We're going to come back to that. Yeah, that's the anthropology of human beings has that.
And I say to them, that is a form of what philosophers call anthropology, or it's humanism. It's an account of what it means to be human. And so, you know, one of the things I try to, you know, convince them of is look, this is literally not true. It's
made up.
I like your dramatic pause there, Gene. Not true at all. It's crazy.
It's not just that scarcity and this account of human beings is unedifying. It isn't true. Mm-hmm. You know, and I asked them, you know, look at your own experience. Do you look at your friends and you know, boyfriends, girlfriends, fathers, mothers? Do you look at people this way? Mm-hmm. No, you have to be taught to think this way.
Yeah, yeah.
And you know, I don't really think that this is how you all act when you leave Econ 101.
I want to insert one thing very briefly. And it is one of a few soapboxes I have, but it's the notion, working again with young people in the church. You're at Villanova, it's a Catholic institution. I know what takes place there, Gene, because it took place at Bonaventure, it takes place at Marygrove, is that the business school has that anthropology, competitive individualism, as you say, like, you know, utility maximization. But then the Catholic Church outside of that go to theology, and we have an anthropology called persons in communion. I want to put before our bishops, until we can unpack that disparity, and the Catholic Church starts, we give up this kind of schizophrenia, that we allow it in one place, that there should be nobody coming back to our churches. There should be because it's making people so confused.
Mike, I would go one step further. I would say abolish the business school.
Yeah.
So did I.
First of all, I think, a lot of what's taught there is pernicious.
Yeah.
And secondly, when did business become an academic discipline?
I know. Is that the joke?
I sometimes wonder how it is that capitalism ever got off the ground.
Yeah.
Before they had business schools. I don't think Andrew Carnegie went to business school.
You got to meet our friend Guido Peperata. He was, he's a social scientist at the Gregorian. And you guys would get along because he expresses astonishment. He knows for a fact, and he's, I think, one of the world's great economic minds, but he goes like, there's no surer way to ruin the brain than an economics class. He goes, it's but it is. It's the craziest science out there. It's the craziest science out there. And it's not a science.
Well, as it's currently taught, I mean, if you're going to teach economics, it seems to me that the discipline should properly be called political economy.
Way to go. That's at least had something interesting to say, how power is grabbed by playing with these things. Agreed.
One of the things I don't go into this so much in the book, but I mean, one of the reasons that political economy became economics was that you give a certain kind of ideology a sort of scientific veneer. So you don't have to talk about classes. You don't have to talk about race. You don't have to talk about gender. You don't have to talk about power.
Yeah.
Because you would have to then concede that economic activity is also political at the same time.
And it's part of the humanities in a way, right? And it's interesting you mentioned that the scientificification of it, because if you know I do, the history of literary criticism, for instance, or I'm sure it's the same in history, about the middle of the 20th century, everybody wanted to be a scientist. So literary criticism became scientific. It's a kind of a joke.
Right?
I'm
thinking of that line from W.H. Auden, thou shalt not commit a social science. Where that's from. I think it's from some poem he read at maybe Phi Beta Kappa at Harvard or something. Yeah. I just remember just laughing out loud when I read it.
I've proposed a moratorium on all interdisciplinary social sciences for at least 50 years, like sociobiology. Just stop for a while. Let us catch up with the idiots.
Don't tell a lot of my friends down the hall about that.
It's also kind of scandalous that Thomas Malthus was a political economist, right? Because then people know the game is up. They can see that, like, when you actually put your cards on the table, what this whole dismal science is about. It's about making people superfluous and eventually about like reducing population and things like it's a very dirty thing.
It is nefarious. I mean, when I first cracked open the essay on the principle of population, I couldn't believe it. I mean, I thought, wait a minute, this guy is a vicar?
Yeah.
Arson, yeah.
God. It's awful. And that whole school of evangelical British economic thinking,
and that's I think that's one of the brilliant things in your book that you tie, and so many of those allegedly the Christians, Christian. What would you say?
They tried to call it Christian political economy.
Well, I didn't know that. Yeah.
I even had there's a historian, I think his name is A.M.C. Waterman, who wrote a book, on Christian political economy, a pretty good one, in fact. And I got to get this off my chest. The only bad book was written by a W.C. Waterman.
Okay.
And I thought, man, what did I ever do to you? Because I think his book's actually pretty good. But his contention was that I did not understand a thing about economics.
That's
basically I should go back and I guess
read Ludwig von Mises or something, right?
Well, here I'm going to bust out a quote from your book here. Oh, you're talking about Uri. The evangelical policy in Ireland during the Great Famine of the 1840s embodied its infernal counterpart. To evangelical economists, the Almighty's didactic malevolence was evident. The starvation that racked the Irish people was the judgment of God on the selfish, perverse, and turbulent character of the Irish people. And in the words of Charles Trevelyan, prominent evangelical and chief administrator of the famine relief, it was the direct stroke of an all-wise and all-merciful providence.
This is the director of Relief.
of relief.
Right.
Yeah. Don't help me anymore.
Yeah, but think of the amount of damage that has been done by quote unquote the laws of supply and demand, and the idea of, again, reminding the person at Walmart that he's free to work there, right? We look him in the eye and say, you're free to walk out to starvation.
Yeah, the 19th century artisans had a much clearer grasp of what was going on. I mean, they would often talk about wage slavery.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And when I mention this in classes, there's a lot of head scratching. Like, well, wait a minute. I mean, you're free to walk out of a job you don't like and all this. But I said, look, really, are you free? Are you really free to quit a job? Basically what you're talking about with wage labor is basically choosing your master.
Yeah.
Rather than your master choosing you.
We beat up on distributists a lot on this, Gene, for not doing anything, the modern distributists, but like the insights of Belloc on wage slavery, they're great. Belloc is great on this stuff, but it's the thing is self-identified distributist doesn't do anything with it, but it's 100% true.
That's the curious thing, I think, about Belloc and Chesterton and the rest of them, is that it's not clear to me, like, sort of what political direction they would have gone in. Though
Yeah.
I suspect that probably Belloc, I might be misinterpreting him here, so correct me if I'm wrong. My reading of one of his books, I'm trying to remember which one it was, maybe an essay on the restoration of property or something like that.
Yeah.
My impression was that he almost makes a kind of Leninist turn and says, look, we are going to have to get government involved in this.
Yeah.
And,
Right.
Making up large concentrations of wealth and so on.
Yeah, he thinks you could use small government to, think of like Vermont. You could have a small government say that you're allowed one McDonald's in Burlington. The second one we're going to tax a lot. The third one we're going to tax out of existence. But he still believed they could do that with a really kind of small government that was always there, just kind of breaking up property. I haven't read Belloc on this stuff or really thought about him for about 20 years, but I found it compelling when I read it,
Yeah, I mean, I think the most interesting of Belloc's books to me, of course, is The Servile State.
Pretty interesting and relevant.
Yeah.
There are long passages in that book where if you didn't know it was Belloc, you would think, is this like a Marxist account of capitalism?
Yeah.
The displacement of peasants and the gathering of workers into factories and so on.
That's it's interesting that you say that, because as I was reading your book this week, and you see all these Christians kind of capitulate to the capitalist monster, right? They just get subsumed by it. And was it, I don't know how long ago, 6 months ago, Mike, that we interviewed Lori Johnson on distributism?
She was good,
right? And one of the things she said that really kind of stuck with me, we talked about why nobody does anything with distributism except for read The Hobbit once a year. That
24-hour reading of The Hobbit. Well, and you have to be in costume.
That's what distributism is now. But she said, well, the capitalist machine is too powerful. You couldn't do it because we're talking. So in my CSA, for instance, which is kind of an attempt at a kind of distributism, right?
Before I talk about disenchantment, let me just talk about the notion that the capitalist machine is too powerful. I'm not so sure anymore. I sometimes go back and forth between, the machine is too powerful, and we all just might as well adopt some kind of quietist, political stance. Mm-hmm. But then I think at other moments that people like David Graeber and Wolfgang Streeck are right, that we seem to be in some kind of a transitional period where capitalism as we know it, at least, just isn't delivering the goods anymore. And sort of everybody knows it. I think neoliberalism has kind of passed as a persuasive ideology. Mm-hmm. Maybe not in Britain yet. I mean, with Rishi Sunak and the Tories, I don't see that certainly regnant in the Republican Party, and even among the Democrats. I don't really see it as all that convincing anymore. But the problem is, I think what it may be evolving into is something that you might call techno-feudalism or managerial,
Yeah.
where essentially, you're going to have this kind of rentier economy,
Mhm.
and you're just going to have a lot of low wage.
I think you're 100% right on that, Gene. Yeah. No, they say too that capitalism, like once you drain a parasite, once it drains the last bit of vitality out of everything, we're in the late stages of
Right.
like vulture capitalism, and then it will necessarily morph. But it does get into, when we think of the foe of capitalism and automation and the dynamo, the I still believe when we used, I want you to speak to this in our correspondence, the totally seminal nation of Henry Adams on the Virgin and the Dynamo, because it's really the blueprint. Michael's, I think in Michael's work, Sophia in Exile and others, the notion between like left and right, let it go. But those forces lined up behind the dragon, the dynamo, and those of the Virgin. So it's not just the Virgin and the dynamo. Henry Adams could have seen the Virgin falling before the dynamo, and I want you to speak to that. But also, I think the powers inherent with the Virgin. Water running downhill eventually doth penetrate every solid substance. It finds a way. A true ethic of nonviolence, a Christian nonviolence, and these things can make this dynamo stumble upon itself. But if you want to weave in your story of enchantment, but I knew in our correspondence we were going to talk about the Virgin and the dynamo, because Henry Adams saw it all. If you even give a synopsis of what he saw and where. And
yeah, that's a nice way actually into the thesis.
Yeah.
Actually, before that, even a critique of Max Weber. So, right, the dynamo and the Virgin is probably one of the most famous passages out of his autobiography, The Education of Henry Adams. And he starts off, in this, what I'll call putatively secular way, right? He's looking at the dynamo and he's thinking, wow, this is really powerful.
And say what a dynamo was for him, right? Because it's such an evocative word. What were these machines he saw in the parish exposition?
Well, they were Westinghouse dynamos. I mean, they were generators, basically.
Okay, yeah.
Huge machines, which, basically made him feel puny, small. And, one way to latch onto that with the disenchantment thesis is to say that, well, most of us think of industrialization and capitalism and financialization and so on as utterly secular phenomena, right? It's all about money, it's all about avarice, it's all about technological development and so on. And it doesn't seem to have any sort of a sacred or religious dimension to it at all. And this is basically the thesis that was made famous by Max Weber. He mentions it a little bit in the Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, but he amplified on it in other essays. And basically the idea is that the modern world is disenchanted. We don't attribute the world or its existence or anything that we do. We don't attribute it to spiritual or religious forces anymore, right? We don't think that there are wood nymphs. We don't think that there are all these animated sort of spirits and demons or goblins who inhabit nature in any way. We just think a tree is a tree is a tree. A dynamo is a dynamo is a dynamo. There's nothing religious about it. And Adams, in his essay, basically, he's not mentioning Weber at all, but he's saying, no, there's something about this dynamo that calls upon what he calls, occult mechanisms. He actually calls the dynamo an occult mechanism because he seems to think that because the dynamo is such a powerful piece of technology, this to him is a sign that human beings are now beginning to worship what he calls infinite force. Right. And as much as human beings think they are actually beginning to control nature with machines like the dynamo, Adam's fear is that in fact human beings are themselves going to become the servants of machines.
Mhm.
They're going to become the servants of the system that the machine represents. And this to me is what I call misenchantment. So in other words, capitalism, in my view, takes on many of the qualities of a religion. You're going to have Bill Kavanaugh, on next week. This is what he would call, I think, a migration of the holy. So, agency and attributes that we once used to assign to God or the gods, we now basically assign to money. Money becomes, in effect, the sort of the mana or the sacramental principle of capitalism, if you will. Again, I'll refer back to some of my freshman, business students. They have this concept called effective demand. And what effective demand is, I don't know if you know what this is. So in economics, effective demand means if you have a desire or a want or a need, but you have no money with which to purchase the commodity that will satisfy this need, your need does not exist.
Mm-hmm. Scarcity again, enclosure.
It doesn't exist, right?
Yeah.
It, as a matter of the marketplace, it's null and void, right? And again, that is a metaphysical claim, right? But also, what does that imply? Money brings things into existence, right? Oh, once I have money and I can buy a bottle of water, or I can buy, a hamburger at McDonald's, or something like that. Then,
don't you love it too when, like in Africa, they'll say, economists will say, people were making nothing. Now they're making $5 an hour in a factory, as if their whole wonderful life with subsistence agriculture was making nothing, right? They don't have a way to measure it. Yeah.
Wait, where did they get the clothes and food to begin?
Right.
Yeah,
and they can put the one on a graph, and it's a form of enclosure. Only things that are graphable. Yeah.
And so money, I think actually in his way, Marx captured this quite beautifully. I mean, in his notion of commodity fetishism and capital, where, the value of things is wholly determined by the price that they will fetch in the marketplace. And so, I think in some ways Marx was a keener theologian than he realized. It's just that, he was so committed to producing a secular narrative of capitalism that, he just kind of dismisses, this language and just calls it a lot of metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties. I mean, he's being sardonic there, but I actually think he's quite insightful in what he's saying about the nature of commodities and the nature of capitalism. So that's why I think that Weber is just wrong in the disenchantment thesis. Now, there's a whole lot of reasons how this, of course, occurred. And I do think that the Protestant Reformation is still key to this. But I don't think it's the only, cause. And, I mean, I'm one of these historians who thinks that you can see the seeds of this in the late medieval period, on any number of levels. But so if it's not disenchantment, it's certainly misenchantment.
Right.
Because basically, when people say that, people in capitalist societies worship money, they're saying a lot more than they realize. I mean, they're not, that's not just a metaphor. It's not just a sort of a hackneyed, banal metaphor. It's a reality.
You had something so nice to say about Marx there too, and that I think your book is really, really excellent on showing kind of the wake or the wreckage in the wake of the fact that Marx was so successful on huge portions of the left that there was no room left for the left, small L and capital L, that interests you so much and really interests Michael and I, like this romanticism piece, and then also what your book does, I think it's very much tied, so that Marx crowded out any notion. And that also, I think, when Marx crowded that out, nobody could see your thesis that, again, this is another religion. But the other piece was, just speak to that first, I guess.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, I think one way to think about the history of the left before the Bolshevik Revolution is to see it, in fact, as a much more capacious and much more imaginative political sensibility and political imagination than we often think. I mean, now when we hear the left, we think, oh, it must have been basically Marxist
Yeah.
for 1917, and that's simply not true.
Right.
Even if you're talking about the secular left, right? I mean, you've got all kinds of socialists, you've got anarchists, you've got social democrats, and then you've got this romantic streak, represented by people like John Ruskin and William Morris, and others who, Morris, I think, liked to think he was a Marxist. I mean, this is
Okay.
something that I talk about in the book. Morris, he has this one essay where he says, yeah, I kind of sort of tried to read
Yeah.
that, but it kind of went over
I
my
didn't get it. Yeah.
So, I mean, I admire the candor, but
Mhm.
what it also says is that I think Morris at heart was more of a sort of Ruskinian romantic than he was ever a
Mhm.
Marxist.
We're in your territory, Michael. Yeah, say more.
No,
Michael
absolutely. I
Martin.
think that's what he was. And I think, and you point off in the book, and I have noticed it as well. I mean, part of that becomes a kind of nostalgia for the Middle Ages, right? And
It
that's
does.
all over the place in Morris.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And also what you don't see, and this is what it's interesting. You talked about the left, and now when I think of the left now, I think of neocons. I think of pro-war, surveillance state. That's what I think of now. But that's not what I used to think of, right?
I'm not sure there is a
Years
left.
ago, when my wife
No,
and
there's not a meaningful left anymore that
no,
represents
so
dissent.
here's an example
Yeah.
of the romantic left. So when my wife and I married, now we're married 31 years ago, we were into organic farming and not vaccinating our kids and homeschooling and home births, and people thought we were raging lefties. And if you say that to somebody now, they go, wow, you're a conservative, huh? And you talked about that in the book with the romantic right and the romantic left.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting, that was actually a really helpful way for me to think about this. And we see now, people we've interviewed on the show, like John Michael Greer and Paul Kingsnorth, which I would say are kind of people of the romantic right in a way, right? So I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit, Gene. It's really a fascinating topic.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the way that I think about the left has historically been a political imagination, political movements that try to put some sort of democratic controls on property and property accumulation.
Mm-hmm.
So I do see a kind of inherent conflict and antagonism.
But you're infringing on people's right, their freedom to make other people starve there, Gene. So
I know. Is thwart that right. Yes, liberty. Yeah, I mean, I do think that there's a fundamental antagonism between democracy and certainly capitalist forms of property. The funny thing is that I think a lot of the left was aware of this until maybe the 1960s or 70s. I mean, I think what happens in the 60s with the left, certainly the American left, is that they become less interested in issues of exploitation and redistribution, and they become more interested in questions about identity. They become more interested in issues about, it becomes a more sort of psychoanalytic left, right? I mean, you see, this is why figures like Herbert Marcuse, I think become so significant. And it's why a lot of the left, certainly, surrounding Jacobin magazine, are all enthusiastic about automation.
Mm-hmm.
You've now,
it's super important, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Now got people.
But also, it's also about power, right? They became more interested in accumulating power, where that was not the thing.
Accumulating power, but also I think and I think this is really key. The left lost its links with the labor movement. Because they became less and less interested in labor. So you've got, what you have now is a left that seems to think this way. And I'm thinking about, people like Aaron Bastani, who's coined this phrase, fully automated luxury communism. He goes on he goes on in that book by the same title about how wonderful Elon Musk is.
Yeah.
You know, I'm thinking, wait a minute. You're a Marxist, or at least you're a self-proclaimed Marxist. You know, you're not supposed to be praising Elon Musk.
Mhm.
Though if I'll go back on to that in a moment, because I think there's a sense in which Marx does in fact set this up by praising the progressivism of capital and so on. And so what I think is going on with a lot of sectors of the left these days is that they're essentially thinking this way: we're going to offload our political imagination to Silicon Valley. We're going to let Musk and Zuckerberg and Gates and all of these Silicon Valley tech bros create the technology of abundance, which they think is going to create socialism and then communism. And then we're just going to somehow take it over.
Yeah.
Yep.
As though number one, how are you going to do this without a labor movement? How are you going to do this without a mass movement? But also, isn't it the case that technology under capitalism is precisely designed to enhance the power of capital? So therefore, you're going to take over a
No, you
structure,
said it well. Yep.
right?
Yeah.
So let me get this straight, right? You're going to take over a structure, an institutional and technological edifice, which is designed for the purpose of exploitation. And you're going to somehow make it liberating.
Yeah. Well, and plus the other part of that with automation, and we've heard this quite a bit. I mean, what's his name? Noah Yuval Harari, right? We don't need so many people, right? That's where they're.
Yeah.
So which people did you have in mind of getting rid of?
Well, yeah, Harari is a perfect example, and it brings us back to enchantment and religion,
Mhm.
because Harari is one of these guys who's into transhumanism,
Right.
And
Talk about enchantment, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
these like the first chapter of the book I'm working on is entitled "The Mega Machine and the Virgin." I mean, it's an
Lewis
allusion.
Mumford meets Henry Adams meets. Yep.
Yeah, and I trace. There's sort of a history I trace there, but it ends up with people like Ray Kurzweil and Harari, who are talking about immortality through machinic transformation of the human.
Right.
And I mean, I think this is insane. I think it will never happen. But to me, what's interesting is the desire.
Mhm.
Why would you want to do this? And this is where I think this is what is connecting the two books, Enchantments and the one I'm working on now. I do think that this desire for transhumanism stems from a desire to be godlike. Now, here's the thing. I don't think that's bad. Wanting to be godlike, it seems to me, is, I think it's endemic to our nature.
It's a form of theosis applied accurately. Yeah.
Here's the catch.
Mhm.
If you want to be godlike, everything then turns on what you think God is like.
Mhm.
If you think that God is essentially about power and sovereignty and autonomy and will and agency, you're going to end up with transhumanism.
Mhm.
Yeah.
This is the logic of the mega machine. This is I think the logic of capital. If you think that God is love, well, I think you're going to end up in a different place with the way you think about technology, the way you think about what it means to be human, and so on.
Yeah.
So part of the story that I'm tracing in the book on automation is in fact the story of how we think about God.
Right.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
I don't know if you caught this, but just this week, Harari came out with some ludicrous statement about having ChatGPT rewrite the Bible.
Wow. Is he just being needlessly provocative there to distract?
To make it more accurate or something.
Yeah.
I can't remember the term he used, but
Don't you think, like both of you, that we have, let's, for a moment, I'm just thinking out loud, we have, let's say, the Enlightenment, prior to that, Romanticism, or no, I mean the Enlightenment, Romanticism, and then you have postmodernism. But and this comes up, it's implied in your book, Gene, and I think it's stated directly, is that we have people who in one sense are postmodernists, right? In the transhumanist way, in some of the gender stuff, the excesses. But in this automation piece, they're just pure creatures of the Enlightenment. And that what Owen Barfield called romanticism comes of age would be, in Mike Martin's lexicon, it would be a poetic metaphysics, but the people who, in order to get some progress in this conversation, we have to keep on calling out people who kind of pose as postmodernists, yet in their love of automation are nothing more than just Enlightenment rationalists, right? With all the problems that has of trading nature as a machine of what we've done, and that it makes them, like Marx, his colonization of the whole left, that it allowed romanticism to be kind of, strangled in the cradle. But that subterranean theme needs to come out, and it's a true postmodernism or romanticism that has us talking less about transhumanism, but just about how to transform the planet by creative engagement with it. I see you, Gene. Yeah,
I totally agree with your point about these enthusiasts for automation and for transhumanism being pure children of the Enlightenment. And they're children of the Enlightenment in more than the sense that they want to control human beings through machines. They think human beings are machines already.
They do. They still do. Yeah.
This is a point that Mumford in what was it, Technics and Civilization makes this point, and I think it's a brilliant one. In order for you to mechanize everything, you have to first think that human beings are themselves machines. Right, and that is what, for example, a guy like the Baron de Condorcet, writes in this essay on human progress, which I talk about in this automation book. This guy mathematizes everything, right? Everything is data. Everything is machinery. Now, Condorcet's not the first guy to say this, of course, right? I mean, Thomas Hobbes famously opens the Leviathan by comparing human beings and their limbs to a spring, to a mechanism, right? I mean, they call it the mechanical philosophy for a reason. And I completely agree, but I think it's important to stress that these people already think of human beings as basically sort of incompetent machines. I mean, there's one of these transhumanists, Elise Bowen, I think her name is, who basically says that human beings are nothing but really meat sacks.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's what she says.
And I think you see that also in the kind of transsexual debates we have now, transgender debates, is that the underlying assumption is that it's just a matter of changing parts, like you're retrofitting a car you bought, right? Then it's going to become something different, which is, and this is Mary Harrington, right? She's talked a lot about how the transhumanist movement really started with the introduction of the pill in the 60s, because it changed what being human was. It was the first time where medication was introduced to fix something that was working the right way.
I don't know. I guess I would differ with that a bit, but in terms of both history and maybe maybe philosophical orientation. But I mean, I take the point that in other words, the mechanical model of the human being is one that I think goes back a long, long, long way. And transhumanism becomes in effect the zenith. And again, I think this is something that is pushed by a certain number of capitalist interests, who may not think in these terms about mechanization and transhumanism, but they certainly look to make a hell of a lot of money.
Yeah, it becomes a subscription service, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Now, we've talked about how one of the great sins, when I liked your animated, Gene, when we were talking about economics and that we are utility maximizing animals, when it's just a lie. So we've discussed how living things, we'd say human beings, are being equated with machines, but another, what I believe, central ontological lie, and tell us how it comes up in your thinking. If we use Shakespeare's phrase, you think your ducats sit in the bank and breed like rabbits, or but it's usury, right? The sin that something inert, just a unit of measurement, like inches, becomes seen as something that is living, seemed to really raise Dante's ire, for one, when he looked at it. And Shakespeare saw it through and through. And we're talking about definitions of capitalism or where it began. Our friend, again, Guido Preparata, got to bring you two together, because a lot of people like to distribute us. They kind of rail on usury, or they say, we have those people who say it's charging excessive interest and so forth. Preparata, I was at a conference with him in Italy. He and his band of Italian anarchists, they're working on what he would call the central insight, maybe in the last 500 years, that comes from an economist, Silvio Gesell. Germany, that was a funny period, but one of the side effects of World War I and World War II is talk about romanticism being strangled in the cradle. So many things were strangled in the cradle. That was the place of all great classical music. So much of culture. It was Goethe, Schiller. But of all of those, specifically in the interwar years, Silvio Gesell came up with the notion. He saw that, money has to be perishable, like everything else, which gets this whole thing. So perishable currency, our friend Guido Preparata would say, is, the seminal idea. There's a guy, if you Google that title on YouTube, I'll just never forget Preparata's smile when there's some old, maybe evangelical preacher who's one of the few people to read Gesell. And he's equating Gesell himself with the second coming of Jesus Christ. And I told Guido, about this, and Guido, just thinking about the power of the theory, and the idea that Preparata says, I can't believe I hadn't thought of it. Preparata would say, he just kind of nods and say that the significance of that is possibly the hinge moment to get us out of this impasse. On the other hand, let's just talk about usury, Gene. Where does that factor into your thesis of the power it holds in society? When we talk about how long capitalism can hang on, is it simply how much the usurious interest can drain more and more? Aren't we in the late stage of everything is financialized, right?
Usury doesn't play per se. I mean, it doesn't play a big role in enchantments. What I would say about usury, or just about the whole notion of interest rates, in general, is that it hides the mechanization, or it hides the mechanics of exploitation. I mean, you get people to believe that interest rates are just kind of like natural forces, right? Money breeds money. No, money doesn't breed money.
Money does not breed money.
What happens is the money gets invested in a factory or an office, or something else, and it's the exploitation of workers that creates the profits.
Yeah.
And interest rates. I mean, interest rates are just a way for finance capital to extract something from the production process. It's I sometimes want to say to some of my finance majors here at Villanova, you guys literally don't make anything but money.
Right.
That's what you're trained to do.
They need to get that. Yeah.
Make money. Think about that. The only thing you do is make money. You don't make tables, you don't make chairs, you don't make music, you don't make art, you make money.
Yeah.
I saw a guy on, I forget what channel, I don't know the guy's name, but I even forget where I was, but I must have been sitting in a lobby, and it was like maybe the NBC version of the finance station, but it was a financer and financier. And he was saying, yeah, we run everything. He knows it's a problem. He goes, like, literally everything is driven by us right now.
The key scene in the film Wall Street is not the one where Michael Douglas says greed is good. That's banana. The most important scene is one in his office with Charlie Sheen, right? Charlie Sheen has just found out that Michael Douglas is about to wreck the company that Charlie Sheen's father works for. Mm-hmm. I don't know if any of this is coming back, right? Martin Sheen,
I see, yeah,
like an airplane factory, I think, or something like this. And he's, he charges into the office and says, you lied to me, and all this. And Michael Douglas kind of, says to him, like, what are you, a nitwit? Why are you trying to wreck this company? And he says, because it's wreckable. Mm-hmm.
Because it's wreckable.
And then he says, and then he has this disquisition where he says, look at this painting on the wall. I bought this thing for $60,000 10 years ago. If I sell it now, I could sell it for 600,000. All you do is change the perception. That's what a lot of finance is about.
Mhm.
It's changing the perception, right? It's yeah. Capital, he says, yeah, it's capitalism at its finest.
Yeah.
As
Let's
he
talk a little bit about hopes coming from your book. You mentioned names. I'm embarrassed, but I hadn't heard of them. Vita Dutton Scudder, Book White, and so forth. Who I think there's a lot of names when I spend more time with your book that I have to kind of unearth and spend time with. Where are you seeing signs of hope? Where do you think we need to go from here? You're working on your book on automation, to try and to make it a little more practical. Where are you currently standing?
Yeah. So I guess I'm about halfway through the book right now. It's supposed to be a short book. Believe me. Yeah, I'm not going to devote 20 years of my life to this like I did to Enchantments. Yeah, where am I with this, with hope? So I think one site of hope, and it's a thin one at this point, but it does seem to be showing signs of stirring, is, as I we referred to earlier, the labor movement. I don't see how you're going to get any kind of a handle on automation or this acceleration of technological development until you have a revitalized labor movement.
Mhm.
And it has to be a labor movement that wants more than just higher wages and better benefits.
Mhm.
It has to be a labor movement that wants the whole thing. It has to be a labor movement that wants total control of the workplace. We're the ones who are going to design the technology. We're the ones who are going to decide the pace of our work, the nature of our work, its purposes, and so on. So basically, I kind of sort of want a revival of, I guess, in one tradition, it might be guild socialism.
Sure.
It might have been something like even the Wobblies, were like this, the industrial workers of the world. I think one of the key turns that took place in the labor movement was their adoption of Samuel Gomper's vision when he was asked what workers want. They just said more.
Mhm.
Right. Well, I think,
Do you see stirrings of that labor movement? Or go ahead, Michael.
Well, I think part of what I've been seeing anyway, with the rush for automation that you see from the archons from the World Economic Forum and these people, is they see that coming and they don't want it to happen, right? So they're trying to head it off at the pass.
Yeah.
Right. You'll
think
own
you're right,
nothing
yeah.
and be happy.
I mean,
Talk about enclosure, right? Which I actually interesting with, that phrase became popular during the pandemic, but that article came out in 2016 because I've been using it with freshmen or even older students ever since then, and and it became much more relevant during the pandemic. But that's a long time plan, right?
Was this an article Gene wrote?
No. This was put out. I can't remember her name. I think she's a Danish politician, maybe from the Netherlands. And she wrote, the World Economic Forum had it on their website.
Oh, I see.
The
Gotcha.
whole idea of you'll own nothing and be happy, right?
Oh, yeah. Right.
And what happened? So the first year of the pandemic, I would just link that story or that blog post from the World Economic Forum and give it to the students, and the students complaining that the link's broken. Well, they took it down.
Yeah.
But you can still find it on the Forbes website because it was published there.
Yeah, the World Economic Forum types and the Silicon Valley titans and so on, I do suspect that they've got to do something. I think this is why people like Zuckerberg and Musk have sort of faintly floated the idea that they are in favor of a universal basic income, because they realize that wages are shockingly low, and yet they have an interest in keeping them low. So what are we going to do to have everybody buy our products? Well, I guess we're going to have to literally throw money at them. We're going to have to drop it from helicopters and shoot it out of bazookas, because, the system is just not going to be able to generate enough income for consumption. So, that's one way that they'll try to avert, some kind of social unrest, which might well issue in political movements.
And population reduction figures into that in their project, right? Which is one of the things they're always talking about in the Great Reset, right? You know, we have too many people. Okay, which which people would you like to get rid of? Give us a list.
Like to volunteer. I mean,
that's what I've had that.
I hear this. I just think, okay.
I have 9 kids, and so people, over my career in academia, oh, how could you do that to the environment? Well, it was kind of fun, but kind of fun at the time. But they would say, well, I really think I hear this in the faculty lounge. We have too many people on the planet. And I would say, okay, who would you like to leave? Why don't you volunteer?
Yeah.
So, but Gene, as Mike was saying, giving hope, and I think I love the way you begin the book and the way you end it with Gerard Manley Hopkins, right? Mm-hmm. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. So why did you start and end with that?
Well, because I think that poem is an assertion of sacramentality. It's a beautiful way to say that the world is a sacramental place, mm-hmm. and that God is in a sense everywhere, permeating creation. Not in a sort of pantheistic way, but matter, the material world is capable of conveying the love and the grace of God. Mm-hmm. And what I think happens with capitalism is that basically capitalism becomes predatory on that. It's precisely our desire for satisfying relationship with the material world that capitalism just kind of gets its claws into and won't let go. This is one of the reasons I say early in the introduction and try to exhibit this throughout the books, is to say that, look, I mean, I'm tired of hearing 2 words, materialism and consumerism. Materialism, okay, I get it, a sort of slavish devotion to the acquisition of things and the acquisition of money. But look, the material world is a great place.
Right. Yeah.
Flesh is good.
Mm-hmm.
It's the source of our delight, our joy, our pleasure. Why stop bashing matter, would you? Mm-hmm. Consumerism I have a problem with, because I think, as I say in the book, I think consumerism has become a way of not talking about capitalism. Mm-hmm. It's easy for, I think, certain kinds of moralists, right, to wag their fingers at people.
Especially at Christmas, right? It's just it's become so tired. At Christmas, Yeah,
it's a way of saying, look, you naughty people who
mm-hmm.
drive to the mall and you stuff your cars with presents and stuff and all that. And I'm with John Ruskin. I mean, I think that stuff is good. It's not.
Just need better stuff.
Yeah, you want better stuff. That's the key, mm-hmm. right?
And that's what Morris was doing too, right? That's what the firm was.
The distinction that Ruskin makes between wealth and what he calls ilth is I think one that has to be made central to what we now call economics.
Why don't you talk about that a little bit so the audience gets what you're talking about?
So the way we judge an economy, politicians do this, economists do it, the average person does it for that matter, is to say that, well, we got 2.3% bigger economy this year than last year. Wow, that we're doing well. Okay. In other words, it's a strictly quantitative measure of how well we're doing economically. Now, there are any number of problems with this. I mean, first of all, people who think that 2.1 increase is big. Well, folks, I can tell you that in the 60s you had 5% and 6% growth rates. So don't think that you're doing something special here. But a deeper critique of this is to do the one that Ruskin asked, which is, okay, you increased your economy by 2.3%. So what's in that economy? Did you make more cigarettes? Did you make more nuclear reactors? Did you make more, processed food? Or did you make more vegetables? Did you make more fruit? Did you make more good wine? Did you make, clothes that are, keep you warm and are attractive looking, right? I mean, that's the measure. And also what he says about wealth is I think important as opposed to ilk, which is wealth is as much about the person making the thing as it is about the thing.
Interesting.
He calls it the wealth, he calls the possession of the valuable by the valiant. So in other words, it's not just about the valuable stuff. It's about the person who makes it. So the person who makes it has to be a good person in the making, as well as, making a good thing. And this is something that I think economics just as we conceptualize it now, completely overlooks. It is irrelevant to economics what kind of a person is created through the process of, say, mass production or whatever. Doesn't matter. That person can be alienated, that person can be, de-skilled, whatever, as long as more widgets get punched out. Hey, we're all good, right?
Yeah.
As long as 2.3% more widgets were made last year, it doesn't matter either what those widgets consist of or what the widget maker is like in the process. That's utterly irrelevant in what they're taught in business school.
Right. And I love that. And throughout the book, you draw attention to the arts and crafts movements, both here in the United States and in Britain. And not far from where I used to live, it's a little, maybe an hour and a half from where I live now, is the Cranbrook. Cranbrook.
I've never heard of it.
Christchurch, Cranbrook, and that community. I can't remember who was it that founded it, but they have a little museum, and it's basically a shrine to William Morris. Whoever founded that was really deeply into the arts and crafts movement, and the church they have there is gorgeous. It's an Episcopalian church, and it's just steeped in that kind of William Morris aesthetic about making crafts that serve people rather than serve, the economy.
There are two, well, I guess one is still around. There are two examples of the arts and crafts movement near where I live. There was one called the Rose Valley Experiment, which was in Media, which is maybe about 7 miles from here, maybe 5 miles from here. And there's another one in Delaware called the Arden Theater, which was a combination of the arts and crafts movement and the single tax movement from the 1880s and Henry George and all that, who I guess in some ways was kind of a proto-distributist.
Yeah, in one sense, you read about him in those terms a lot.
Yeah. So the arts and crafts movement, I think, is for me is paradigmatic.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not one of these people who thinks that you have to completely destroy like mass production. I mean, I do think that there, in many ways, it can produce some real goods.
Yeah.
But for me, the principle of artisanship, as in control over the means of production by the worker or workers, is that's what's really central to me to arts and crafts.
Yeah.
And
Seems to me. So go ahead.
I do think that there are ways that you can combine certain virtues of craftsmanship with virtues of from machine production. I mean, a whole group of people thought you could do this. Mumford was one. Another one who I think is interesting was the anarchist Murray Bookchin. Would often write about this. It's also
a real tricky one, right? Yeah, go ahead.
It's also curious to me that often those secular leftists who were romantics, capital R, tended to be anarchists, or they tended to be some sort of very what used to be called libertarian socialism, like Morris. I mean, Morris is this way. Anybody who reads News from Nowhere cannot be convinced that Morris was a Marxist. I don't see how people can still, like E.P. Thompson even did this.
Yeah.
A guy as brilliant as E.P. Thompson still is trying to force Morris into that square peg into a round hole.
It doesn't work.
That's too funny. Yeah. E.P. Thompson, he also he really stumbled upon the rock of the existence of a guy named William Blake. You know, he had to find his lineage. A pure materialist couldn't take somebody who was sui generis, right?
This
You
is the thing I found. One of the things I found when doing the research for this book was that, guys like Thompson, guys like Christopher Hill,
Mhm.
even who I think is just one of the most brilliant historians who ever wrote, they're constantly trying to say that figures like Gerard Winstanley, people like William Blake, well, they're really proto-Marxists.
Right. I know, it's funny, isn't it?
Yeah.
When you get past all that religious nonsense, about God and spirits and all that, they were really doing a kind of proto-materialist analysis. You just want to say,
funny.
are you kidding me?
It's true. So true.
On page 138, Gene, you say, I think it's 138, power, and it's a huge theme today. Power seems to have outgrown its servitude. The sorcery had overwhelmed the sorcerer. You were just saying that, maybe some anarchists saw a way to get the genie back in the bottle. An economist who's not mentioned in your book, but he also gives us another way of seeing the same thing. It's called Polanyi, right? Is that the market for Polanyi was something that happened, again, like outside in the cathedral square from 12 till 3 on one day a week. It was a tool, and they could keep the genie in the bottle. Then everything it blows out, and then everything is seen in terms of market relations. Your index has Eric Fromm in there, right? Of course, he sees love now reconceived in market relations. But the notion that we can get the genie in the bottle is still kind of a tricky one for me. We have these people who try to get convivial tools and so forth. But I think, going back to the Virgin and the Dynamo, when you mention the anarchists and when you distinguish between materialism and consumerism, we have Mater, we have Mother, we have the Virgin, we have anarchism from the bottom up, matter. This is where I guess I'm less sanguine that we can probably, in a way of theory or possibly, labor organization, because this, again, repeating for me, a theme that comes up in a lot. This is the same dynamic when we're seeing when this Ian McGilchrist talks about, brain hemispheric stuff. When the left hemisphere, the dynamo, gets control of the right, he goes, it's an apocalyptic time. So, an apocalypse too is kind of a peeking behind the veil. I think, from a re-engagement or sacramentality, Gerard Manley Hopkins, all this stuff starts to come full circle. If we can get people to look at real things, all of a sudden we could have, I'm writing from the burnt over district, or speaking today from the burnt over district. We have to pray for like a renewed imagination, people's engagement with matter. Matter is good. The divine feminine, the Virgin, and then all these things where they're diluted through scarcity and enclosure. They're seeing money as a living thing when it's dead. They're seeing dead things like economics as living. We definitely need a third, fourth, or fifth great awakening here. But I think it was when you went so eloquently on materialism. Fine, I feel the same way. But those anarchists, the few people who could get control of the tools, this is where I think the rubber meets the road. Can the right brain exert, for the master and the emissary, once the feminine, holistic, it's supposed to send out the left brain to do something. Like I pick up a tool, the pen, and then I can put it down. But all of a sudden, when the pen gets above us and we pray to it, this is really apocalyptic stuff. But it's sacramentality again, getting people to engage with the real. And I think once we start engaging with the real, that can spread like a contagion, because that's also called the kingdom of God, this worldly understanding of heaven. And the kingdom of God in the Gospels spreads like a contagion when we listen to the way Jesus, talk about it.
I'm not that familiar with Ian McGilchrist's work, so I won't speak to that. I mean, but I will speak to especially the notion about the way we think about the kingdom of heaven, the way we think theologically. Look, I was brought up as a sort of pre-Vatican II Catholic. I mean, I was growing up in the like Vatican II era, right? Like mid 60s, and all that. And so, I still tend to think of the kingdom of heaven as, something like up there. I mean,
right.
This is how I think about it, right?
Yeah.
In other words, I don't think about it in terms of materiality, but the more I've thought about it, the more I'm thinking. I've been reading a lot of David Bentley Hart lately.
Right. Yeah.
I think you've had him on this.
We had him and Milbank. You contacted me over when we had Milbank on, and he's great on this. Yeah.
And I think David's way of thinking about this is very good. I mean, the early Christians were communists. I mean, let's just call them what they were. I mean, I think there have been any number of just absolutely laughable exegetical and homiletical strategies to try to get us to not see what the text clearly says.
I agree.
I mean, especially during the Cold War. Now, that word communist is an interesting one because somebody like Ruskin uses it, but he doesn't mean anything like what Marx means by it.
Mhm.
And so, we have to have, I think, some kind of a discussion about what it means to be a communist. What do we mean by the commons, which therefore, influences what we think about enclosure, because you can't have enclosure without a commons first.
Mhm.
So, how do we think about this?
Mhm.
So yeah, part of me wants to say that we should just boldly say that we're commies, and let the chips fall where they may.
That's not bad.
One thing, the only thing wise thing that I ever think came out of the mouth of Pete Buttigieg during the 2020 campaign was somebody asked him about, the Republicans are calling you Democrats all socialists. How do you respond to that? And he said, well, they're always going to call us socialists. So why don't you just say what you think anyway? So
Yeah.
I think that actually reclaiming the legacy of the commons and reclaiming
I think the comments, I agree. Like the word communist, that would be a tough sell for a while. But insofar as it links to the commons, I think Michael and I would agree wholeheartedly. And again, it's not tinny language. It gets to a yearning because it's a poetic metaphysics. Some things that are both ours and mine. That's why Front Porch Republic plays on that same theme, right? A front porch is technically my neighbor's a little bit, but it's definitely mine. And it's Ivan Illich compared it to hair on his skin. The bugs have they're allowed there a little bit, right? And yet this hair area is kind of a form of the commons. It's kind of private and socialist at the same time. And young people, that's a poetic metaphysics, and they're hungry for that. Communism seems enlightenment to them, right? It seems like a system. It seems like a machine. The commons is the height of poetry. It's the height of poetry.
Well, I think that's why the term communitarian might be a little bit more useful, and which doesn't.
It sounds tinny to me.
It doesn't have
doesn't
have the baggage that communists have.
Yeah, but we have to be careful with these words because if the right word, like the commons, everybody would kind of rally behind it. Go ahead.
But most people, and this is the thing, is most people don't know about that history.
No, true.
That's an important history to know about, right? Because it changes everything. Because we've grown up, all of us, through centuries of thinking abnormality is normal.
We could grab the magazine Commonweal that you've written for a lot and make it more about the Commonweal,
Well, I think that's what the editors now are trying to do. I know that.
Oh, really? That's very hopeful.
My sense about Commonweal over the last decade or so is that it has sort of gone, as we say, to the left.
Yeah.
In the sense that it is talking more about capitalism as a system, not just abuses of the system or something like this, but no, the system itself is just rotten. And it we need to get rid of it somehow.
Yeah, I'll have to start reading a little more because again, the title's right there, but it needs to reclaim something a little more than kind of a bland leftism. Yeah.
Commonweal's name derives from a journal that was edited in the 1890s by none other than William Morris.
Oh, okay, yeah.
When Michael Williams, who was the founding editor of Commonweal, founded it in 1924, I think. He stole the title from William Morris's periodical.
Very good.
Can I say something about Karl Polanyi?
Yeah.
Like you mentioned him earlier.
I like him.
That book, I still think that The Great Transformation is an absolutely invaluable book.
It has to be read, yeah.
And it's almost like 80 years old. 1944. I teach chapters from that book in various classes, and it is still astonishing what he's able to grasp.
Yeah, and I
you
think
know,
again, for me, it helps young people see that like this, it kind of cuts between the left and the right, socialism and capitalism too. And it puts it more in the Virgin, the Dynamo, this great thing, the market. It was supposed to serve us, and that's why I'm invoking your language, Gene, that, we're supposed to own this stuff. Now we become totally beholden to it. And that's why we like reading Eric Fromm. But the notion that this thing called the market, yeah, it's like we see it when we go to Italy and somebody's haggling over the price of an orange, but it was always supposed to be a tool in our toolbox. And then somehow, capitalism is kind of the escape from that market to it just hovers over everything in an egregore, and that's why I think the word apocalypse, maybe some people could just wake up to the egregore of the market and say, it doesn't determine everything.
Yeah, it's supposed to be fun, like a farmer's market.
But look at Villanova and look at all of our campuses. Everybody now is seeing, risk management as their way of relationships, right? Like, why would I get involved in this? How much can I get for Eric Fromm was more right than he knew, Yeah. And so that goes back to Karl Polanyi, more right than he knew.
Yeah, I think, I guess in terms of my account of capitalism itself, and I guess where I might differ a little bit from the way John Milbank has been writing about this.
Okay.
John seems to me to be taking a kind of finance-focused account of where capitalism goes haywire. So in other words, it's where the users get involved that everything starts to go, the road to perdition, right?
Yeah.
I guess my historical account would be somewhat more Marxist in the sense that I think it's the very property system itself of capitalism that causes this need to constantly maximize profits and maximize production. I mean, certainly financiers, once they get involved, everything blows up. But I think that there's something inherent in the nature of capitalist property relations, which is something that I think needs to be stressed more. That I think of capitalism more as a property system than as a market system.
Right.
In other words, markets have been around from time immemorial, right?
Of course.
But capitalist markets have not been, and they're I think tied to the way that property is understood and practiced.
So don't you think Milbank also gets wrong? Like, again, Brexit had a lot of problems, there's no doubt. But this notion that like the larger entity is going to be the right entity, again, I find that anti-divine feminine, anti-virgin, anti-matter, because it's so anti-anarchistic that the European Union holding that, like, scale is an important thing. Scale. This the other great author is Leopold Kohr. He said there's no problem in the world that's not a problem of bigness. But there's a huge part of our podcast that hangs on the divine feminine, and I find these multinational entities like anti-divine feminine, in the extreme.
No, I think that it's possible. Okay, so if you take the notion of subsidiarity, seriously, then what does that say? I mean, what it says is that X has to be dealt with at the appropriate scale for X, whatever it is. Now, I think that is compatible, or can be compatible, to some degree, with thinking about large scale institutions or large scale enterprises. If in fact X, or whatever it is best done through some kind of large scale thing. I mean, I do think that those things are compatible. I don't think they're mutually exclusive.
Right. But with control, we're talking about automation and like surveillance. Who's going to police the policeman is the number one question. When you get so they see, isn't it too convenient to look into my town of Hemlock and maybe see, some cop do something wrong? Then you need the next entity. And then it's a surveillance state,
Well, I mean, for example, the idea that, who is it? Shoshana Zuboff has this idea in her book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. She says, well, what we need to do with, well, it's not Facebook now, it's Meta. What we need to do with Meta is we basically need to regulate it. No, we need to destroy it.
Yes.
Because Meta's whole business.
We agree. Yeah.
It's like they say, it's not a bug, it's a feature. It's surveillance is built into Meta.
Right.
Below the
Interesting. So
regulate.
12 years ago, the New York Times, before they became an arm of the state, they had quite a few articles, really concerned about how many people from government, from the FBI and other agencies, were going to work for Meta, or at the time it was Facebook, right? And the New York Times was really concerned about that. Now they're all in.
Well, listen, this is a point that I've made with some of my colleagues, and it doesn't make me popular with them. Whenever Trump goes on about the deep state, I say, okay, look, I can't stand Trump any more than you can, but please don't tell me there's not a deep state.
100% right, Gene. 100% right.
Anybody who knows the history of the CIA, the FBI, anybody who knows anything about the way that the civil rights movement and the anti-war movements were surveilled, invigilated, penetrated by things like COINTELPRO and all this. I mean, come on, people.
I know.
We talked about the demise of political economy as a way of like ruining our ability to get a handle on these things. In a couple of weeks, we mentioned this Guido Preparata. He's inviting his friend. You'll love him, Gene. His name is Eric Wilson. But in Preparata's book, New Directions in Catholic Social and Political Thought, Eric Wilson. So, what we need is a history of like the role of secret police in controlling people. It's just obvious. People don't write on that. The other one is Eric Wilson writes a lot on the role of political murder if you were trying to control people, right? That some people are, why did it end in the Renaissance with the Medicis? People off other people in the name of power. Now you say, gosh, I think Kennedy might have been murdered. You're a conspiracy theorist. Preparata is the one who said conspiracy theorist is too important to be left to conspiracy.
You don't even have to go like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. direction to know, for example, look, Fred Hampton of the Black Panthers was murdered by the FBI, and the FBI admitted it. It's not. This isn't something that you have to be some wacko conspiracy theorist to believe. I mean, they admit it. And so when some of my colleagues, go on about, isn't Robert Mueller wonderful? No, the guy's a cop.
I can't believe this stuff.
I thought we on the left were supposed to be suspicious of cops. I thought we were supposed to be suspicious of the FBI.
And didn't college campuses specialize once upon a time of like questioning the connection to academia and the military-industrial complex, right?
Exactly. I thought, where have you people been? You all seem to be intelligent people. Some of them are historians who know this stuff, and I just think you don't.
What was your anecdote last week, Michael, about that young kid who divulged all those military things? How quickly they found him, and we can't find anything about Jeffrey Epstein, right?
You got that kid in 10 minutes from.
You talk about you talk about a conspiracy theory. I mean, I am one of these people who does actually think Epstein was helped along on his demise.
Me too. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'll just put
the role of political murder in keeping up regimes. This is a more political economy, role of like a political, these studies, the role of secret police in surveillance and things like that. I can't believe we're not allowed to talk about them.
And then we have our patriotism question if we were suspicious about the FBI.
Who's your favorite political commentator? Oh, it's John Brennan. It's all these people. How about Michael McFarland? It's amazing.
These are heroes.
I
remember when John Brennan, was being praised. I used to be on this sort of listserv years back. With a whole bunch of people. And I don't think Bill Kavanaugh was one of them, but he might have been.
Okay.
And I remember when people were praising John Brennan, and I interjected and I said, what are you doing praising this? He's terrible, right?
Same thing you said about Trump and the deep state. Sometimes people ask me about Trump and I'll say like, he had the right enemies. They're like, what do you even mean? That's a very disturbing question. That like he had the right enemies. By and large, a lot of his enemies were bad people. And that seems to make people flip a shit,
Yes. Well, because they can't, this is, I think, one of the basic problems with a lot of my liberal friends and colleagues is that they've lost the talent for making systemic critiques of anything. I mean, everything is now,
well said.
Everything is now personalized. Right? If we just get rid of Trump, everything's going to be fine. No, it's not.
Yeah.
Trump is a symptom. right?
Symptom.
He's not the disease itself. He is a symptom. And if Trump were to go away tomorrow, you would have another one, I think, up and running in another 5 years.
Yeah.
Unless you deal with what led to Trump, you will keep getting these types of figures in America.
And we all kind of agree. A criticism of the left from the left seems to be the most important thing. That was Christopher Lasch. That was your mentor, Jackson Lear's. More of it, because again, the left was just the communist thing for so long. For so many of its leading lights.
But
We're going to have you back on, Gene, when you come out with this book on automation. If not before, you think if it's not 800 pages, we're looking maybe 300. I don't know. You tell me.
Oh, no.
Okay.
So let me just say a little bit about that. So
Okay.
I got interested in this topic, I guess in the mid 2010s, when I started noticing a resurgence of interest in robotics and automation, not just in the business press, but in like left-wing periodicals like Jacobin.
Yeah.
And especially the fact that so many Jacobin writers were celebrants of this.
All in.
What the hell's going on here?
It's in the land in California where their headquarters are, I think. It's just there. It's Silicon or so. I don't know.
So I wrote this 2-part essay for Raritan, Jackson's journal that he edits. And I guess it was maybe about a month before the pandemic began. He asked me if I wanted to turn this into a very short book for this book series that he's editing through Rutgers University Press. It's kind of like, I don't know if you guys are aware of Prickly Paradigm Press. It's an imprint of the University of Chicago Press, and it's basically a bunch of short books on contemporary topics.
Okay.
So they're not usually any longer than about 100 pages.
Oh, okay.
So that's what I'm working on. It'll probably be about 100 pages, maybe a few more.
Very
But
cool.
no, it's not going to be the Leviathan size book.
But everybody agrees, and that's like, let's not. But every page is great, as Michael said. The prose is just superb throughout. I use the index, for so many things.
Wonderful.
I saw you had Robert
It's going to be
Herzig in
around
there.
for a while.
Yeah.
It's
So
going to be one of my go-tos.
this was so much fun. So let's, I think we're all going to part ways, knowing that we're going to reconvene. Hopefully, if Gene, you're willing, reconvene in this space again, if not on a somewhat regular basis. What do you have planned for the weekend, Gene?
Just sitting on the porch of the Airbnb in Wayne and watching the deer and hopefully not the raccoon.
Okay, Michael.
The kids some of the kids are coming. I have 2 kids that live out of state, but I think
for Father's Day,
they're coming
especially.
for Father's Day.
Yeah.
And of course, I have to cook because we just took a steer to the butcher, and he's back, so we're having steak.
Okay, yeah. We have a neighbor who I think a whole cow, when they mix all the good pieces, somebody will just turn the whole cow into hamburger meat. It's really good. And this guy, somebody had to get rid of it. We just inherited a lot of it, but it's the best hamburgers I've ever had. But I'll go to the best baseball team in the world, Rochester Red Wings game tomorrow. My daughter bought tickets for the family. And so this will be great. And Gene, I can't thank you enough. So funny, so intelligent. It's good to see like a good leftist out there. I didn't know there's too many of you around.
Thank God. Yeah.
Hey, we're fighting the good fight.
Yeah. We're gonna come look at you in a museum sometime.
Continua.
Yeah. It's great. All right. Thanks everybody. Thanks listeners for listening to the Regeneration Podcast. We'll see you next week.